This is Paul Schmid. Welcome to the Pursuit Zone. My guest today is Pete Marshall. Pete has paddled over 7,500 miles through Canada. In 2005, he and his brother canoed 2,700 miles over 122 days from their home state of Minnesota to the Arctic Ocean. On May 8th of 2012, Pete and 3 others began a 2,600-mile, 130-day canoe expedition across the isolated regions of Canada's Northern Territories, from Skagway, Alaska to the Hudson Bay. You can learn more about this adventure and purchase a DVD of their expedition titled 2600 Above 60 at the website canoe2012.com. Pete Marshall, welcome to the Pursuit Zone.
Thanks, Paul.
Pete, tell me about how you got started in canoeing.
Yeah, so I got started canoeing when I was 16. That was the first time I went on an extended canoe trip. And that was through a program called Les Voyageurs, which was ran by biology teacher Fred Rupp at the high school I went to, Cathedral High School in St. Cloud, Minnesota. And Les Voyageurs is a nonprofit organization that Fred runs, and it brings boys around age 15 to 16 after their sophomore year in high school and girls after their junior year in high school to the Atakai Provincial Park in central Manitoba for canoe trips that last around 4 weeks. And there's it was kind of a thing to do at my high school. So I wasn't really excited to do it, but I just kind of thought this is something I should try to do because my brother had done it and a host of other people I know, host of other friends were doing it, and people I know who are older than I were doing it. So I thought I should sign up as well and give one of these canoe trips a whirl. And that's kind of how it started.
So what was it about it that hooked you?
Yeah, that's a good question because I was even Fred today, he will tell you I was kind of an unlikely candidate to go on a Voyageurs trip. You know, I wasn't particularly athletic. I didn't play any sports, just kind of a lazy, whiny teenager at that time. And, it was the first 2 weeks on trail, was just hard. And I think that's a common response. We had these 80-pound packs. It rained every day for a week almost, trying to carry these canoes that weighed about 80 pounds on my shoulder, and I weighed maybe 110 pounds. It was just hard. I never did anything like that. I never really encountered a challenge at that level. And most of the first 2 weeks, I was just thinking, do I like this? Do I want to go home or not? And then something kind of clicked maybe about 3 weeks into the trip. I just I don't know. I guess I just woke up to the magic and the wonder of canoe travel in this amazing, almost untouched environment we were in. And as the trip ended, I think like a lot of young people, I didn't feel like I was ready to go home. And getting on the bus to go back to the States, I just thought I need to do more canoe trips. And then the next year, there was an advanced Voyageurs trip that went up to Nunavut in Canada, and that was on the Kazan River, and that was in the tundra, so no trees, a little more extreme conditions. And after those 2 trips, I was 17, and I kind of just thought, I want to do as many canoe trips as I can with my life. So that's kind of the short story of how it all got started.
Sure. Now, tell me about how you came up with the idea for this 130-day 2,600-mile canoe expedition across the Northern Territories.
Sure. I think I came up with the idea in 2009, and I came up with the idea after a long 45-day canoe trip on the Back River. And the Back River is kind of one of these Mount Everest of canoe rivers out there. It's it's completely above the tree line. No trees at all. It's over 600 miles, big lakes, a lot of whitewater. And I was fortunate enough to do this river, and I never thought I'd be able to do it. But I did it. And at the end of the Back River, I really thought, that this was going to be kind of my farewell to canoeing trip. I was going to go off to grad school. I was going to work towards my PhD in English literature. And so while I thought this was my goodbye to canoeing for 7 or 8 years, I also just kind of got this bug in my mind. And I have this habit of looking at maps, and that habit usually manifests itself in a way that I want to connect various rivers, various lakes into maybe potential canoe routes. So this day, about 2 weeks after I got done with the Back River, I was looking at an atlas. Actually, I think I was reading or something, and I started to think about putting together one of these big canoe trips, and I looked at an atlas, and my finger kind of traced the Nahanni and the Thalan rivers, which are two of the most sought after canoe trips north of 60. And I kind of just pieced together waterways between them. And after about 2 or 3 hours of searching on the internet, looking up trip reports, I kind of convinced myself that there was a way to cross the Rocky Mountains, which was going to be the major challenge, and connect these two rivers and ultimately connect the Pacific Ocean with Hudson Bay and what to my mind was just this big, magnificent canoe route. So really it was just born out of curiosity for me. That's how I came up with it, and this habit of connecting waterways and seeing what's possible out there.
Now, would you ever consider going on one of these big expeditions by yourself?
I play with that idea a lot, but when I'm out there, it really occurs to me how important it is to have a crew or to have another person with you. Just you get a kind of weird thoughts in your head when you're alone for long enough. And then I think what's more, it's just to have that motivation, to have someone there alongside with you, and you kind of feeding off their energy and then you're motivating them as well. So you have that relationship that really helps push you those extra few miles at the end of the day, or get up that just a little bit earlier. The times I've done solo trips in the boundary waters have been pretty relaxing trips, and it's been very easy for me to call it a day early or sleep in. So I don't know if by myself I would have the full motivation to do a trip like this.
Tell me about the crew you assembled.
Yeah, so the crew consisted of 3 other young men. And the first person who was really excited to do this trip and wanted to see it happen was Winchell Delano. And I had known Winchell since 2002. He was on the first trip that I organized outside of any organization, and that was on the Missinaibi River in Ontario. And he was still in high school when we did that river together, and that was after my second year in college. And then I was on the Back River with him as well. And then I just kind of casually told him in conversation about this magnificent canoe route that I had come up with, these plans. But at this point, they were just kind of plans. I actually didn't have any idea that I was going to do this someday. It was kind of a dream of a dream. And I told him about it, and then a few days later he called me, and I ran into him again, and he just started to talk about putting a crew together and dates of when we were going to do it and kind of logistical plans. And I basically told him, I said, like, no, we can't just go and do this river, or we can't go and do this route. This is almost impossible. Because, at this point it was still so distant from me. But the more we talked about it, the more it seemed like a feasible idea. And then ultimately he kind of blackmailed me, and he said, well, you can do this trip with me, or you can read about me doing it with some other guys. So he essentially forced my hand, and we got to planning then. So it was the 2 of us at the beginning stages, and we knew that we wanted to have a crew of 4. So we recruited Steve Caveney, who I've known since I was probably about 12 or 13, and I've done a handful of canoe trips with Steve as well. Steve, he's worked as a wilderness therapist for 5 years out in Utah. He's something of a kayak bum, probably the best whitewater paddler I know. I'm really good at whitewater instruction as well. And so we somehow managed to convince Steve to come with us. And then Matt Heron, who I had met several times beforehand, and he had worked with Winchell as a guide for lay voyagers and had a trip to the Hudson Bay under his belt, and so was well experienced with whitewater and canoe travel and guides as well. So I met with him and went over the route with him, and he was pretty excited about it from the beginning. And that's how we assembled our crew of 4, and kind of a brief rundown of the 4 guys who were on the trip.
Tell me about the main sections of the route and the challenges they presented.
Sure. The trip started at Skagway, Alaska. And the first part of the trip actually didn't involve canoeing. We hiked over the Chilkoot Pass, which is a very historically famous route that the gold miners in 1897, 1898 would take to get to the Yukon River. And we got there, we started on May 8th, and we had an outfitter from the other side of the mountains come and pick up our canoes and all of our paddling gear and bring them to the headwaters of the Yukon. And we were just going to hike the pass and then hike to where our canoes and paddling gear would be waiting for us. So we started on the Chilkoot Pass, and it was May 8th, like I said, and it was still essentially winter when we got up into the mountains. Skagway is a coastal rainforest, so there was no snow, but then day 2 we were walking through what was essentially a blizzard, 50-mile-per-hour winds to our back, snowshoeing over 20, 25 feet of snow until we eventually had to camp that day because of whiteout conditions. So we got through the pass in about 4 days. It took us a lot more snow than we expected. A lot of people told us it was the record snowfall they had in the last 10 years, for about 10 years. And then we got through the mountains, got onto these railroad tracks that are abandoned until about June, and hiked into Carcross, which is on the headwaters of the Yukon River, picked up our canoes, all of our paddling gear, and we got to paddling from that point. And we were all really excited to start paddling because we're not really good hikers, and we're from Minnesota. We're not mountaineers. So we were excited to start paddling, but paddling wasn't really going to happen at this point because the lakes were still choked with ice. It was a very slow spring in the Yukon and Alaska area that year. So the headwaters of the Yukon were just crusted with this kind of rotting ice that's too weak to really walk on, but too thick to break through. So we had to kind of drag our boats along shore, and that took a little more time than usual. But we got into the Yukon River itself, and that was a nice, easy downstream paddle for about 3 or 4 days. And then the big challenge of the trip began. And the major challenge that I anticipated in coming up with this route, and it also proved to be the most difficult part, was going upriver about 500 miles to get to the Continental Divide that is crossing the northern Rocky Mountains in the Yukon Territory. So we had to start going up the Pelly River first. And the Pelly River is a very wide river that has a very steady current, very consistent current, probably about 4 to 5 miles per hour. And we started going up the Pelly River, and all the snow that was gathered in the mountains once we started going up also started to melt. So we soon ran into flood conditions where the shore was completely washed out, whole forests were underwater, and that, of course, just made the river all the more difficult to travel up. But we slowly made progress, maybe 8 to 10 miles a day, 12-hour days we're putting in. And then we got to a tributary of the Pelly River, the Ross River, which would bring us to the Continental Divide. And that was much smaller than the Pelly River, but it was also much steeper than the Pelly River.
So how many days into this are you now?
So we got to the Pelly, I think, around day 22. And then we got to the Ross River probably around day 42 or day 44. And then it was probably, I think, about another at least 3 weeks getting up the Ross River. And the Ross River brought us deeper into the mountains as well. So we're in this incredibly beautiful area, but the river's really dropping at this point. There's a lot of violent drops, big waves we have to maneuver our canoes around. And at this point, travel's more difficult. Well, maybe as difficult as we anticipated it, but it's always harder in reality than you plan for it to be. So we did eventually get to the Continental Divide. There's definitely moments of doubt that we could ascend these rivers. But we got to the Continental Divide and portaged about 3 miles to the headwaters of the South Nahanni River, which for anyone who canoes in Canada, they know that the South Nahanni is one of the jewels of Canadian rivers and is really one of the most beautiful areas in the world. And it was just all the more spectacular because we were going to be going downstream at this point. So we got on the South Nahanni River, which starts off as a really an amazing whitewater run, very technical and big rapids for the first 100 kilometers, 60 miles or so. And then it kind of mellows out and you're just in this incredible mountain valley. And then it drops over Virginia Falls, which is over 300 feet tall, and then descends into these series of canyons that at their tallest reach about 1,000 feet, just sticking up right from the riverbed. And from the Nahanni, we pretty much left the mountains. And that was around day 72, I think, if I remember correctly. Paddled off the Nahanni River onto the Liard River. And now we are in just these kind of flat mid-continental plains. There's really no topography, nothing really eye-catching. But travel, of course, was much easier at this point. And then we went up the Mackenzie River, which is a huge, enormous river, almost 2 miles wide in parts. And going up this river was much easier. It's pretty lazy and slow current. And then we got onto Great Slave Lake, which is the 10th largest body of fresh water in the world. And we went about 300 miles from west to eastern, the western end to the eastern end of Great Slave Lake. And once we hit the eastern end of Great Slave Lake, it was, I think, probably around day 100, day 105. And it was middle of August. And middle of August in this part of the world, in this part of Canada, is pretty much the beginning of fall. And most canoe trips in the tundra end around the middle of August. So we were kind of pushing our luck by venturing into the tundra, into the last portion of our trip this late in the season. We're really risking potential sleet storms, even snowfall, and then the wind that just would keep going in this part, and it could pin you down for several days at a time. So we got off Great Slave Lake onto Pike's Portage and onto the Hanbury-Thulon River system, and that took us all the way to Baker Lake, which is connected to an inlet called Chesterfield Inlet of the Hudson Bay. And after we got to Baker Lake, I think around September 7th, and we had about 200 miles to go from there to reach the Hudson Bay. And then we had spectacular luck with the weather. We did get pinned down for one whole day because of wind, but it took us 8 days from the mouth of Baker Lake to reach the community of Chesterfield Inlet, where we ended our trip on September 14th.
Did anybody there know that what you had done when you arrived? I think the RCMP officer, the Mountie, basically the police officer in town, knew about us. We had another canoeist that I knew had been in the area the previous year and called him just to say, there's these 4 guys who are out in the middle of nowhere coming near your town, so keep an eye out for them. But otherwise, it's a small town. It's 300 people. Everyone's very friendly, and we made friends quickly, but no one knew that what we had just finished. But wow.
We met a few people when we got there.
Congratulations. It's a great accomplishment.
Yeah, it was an interesting feeling to get out of the boats for the last time.
How'd you guys hold up physically?
So physically, we did really well considering the conditions we put ourselves in and the potential hazards that we face along the way. No one got sick along the way. We did have issues with feet just because we were in the water for so long going upriver. We were out of the boat probably 80% of the time going up those rivers. And we had dry suits, which kept us dry, except for the fabric started to kind of deteriorate along the feet. And that led in small amounts of water. So we pretty much had damp feet 13, 14 hours a day. And three of us developed trench foot, and Winchell and I got a really bad case of trench foot. And there's a point on the Nahanni where I was worried that this could be a potential trip ender because I couldn't even stand up straight. It would my leg would throb and just have this intense stabbing feelings of pain that would wake me up at night as well. But luckily, the woman who had our second resupply in Fort Simpson after the Nahanni was also the chief medical officer in town. And her prescription was pretty simple for it, was just soak your feet in vinegar, in diluted vinegar water, and that pretty much took care of my trench foot. But beyond that, we had sunburn, bug bites, but we held up very well physically.
How many times did you resupply?
We had 3 resupply points, and those were spaced about 35 to 40 days apart. And we set those up before we left. Winchell and Matt, they were out based in Utah at the time. They drove up with all the food up into Canada and mailed them from Canada in April to the various resupply points.
Did that prove to be enough?
Yeah, we had. We ended up. You end up carrying over a lot of food if you're somewhat ahead of schedule from resupply to resupply point. So the last trek, after our last resupply, we had an abundant amount of condiments and like honey and sugar. So we could eat a lot better than we did at the beginning because we weren't so worried about conserving what we had because we had that much extra.
Were you concerned with bears at all?
Yeah, we were. And we just were ridiculously lucky. The first 70 days of the trip in the mountains is all grizzly bear territory. And we saw, I think I was the only one who saw a grizzly bear once, and it saw me and just kind of ran away. And then we saw, I think, 2 or 3 black bears in the Yukon, Alaska area border, and they were just waking up out of hibernation. And then apart from that, we didn't see any bears. Well, we saw a few bears on the shore while canoeing on Great Slave Lake. But I think beyond that, we didn't see any bears. We had no bear encounters. There was the issue of polar bears at the end of the trip, which is a daunting and terrifying creature to think about, these 1,300-pound land carnivores. And they are definitely around the area we were in. And a lot of people at Chesterfield Inlet when we ended were very surprised that we didn't have any encounter with polar bears. So we got lucky on that one. Because
you're in Canada, I wonder, are you allowed to carry guns?
Yeah, it's really it's very easy to bring guns into Canada. It's normally just a 60-day permit that you have to fill out for $25 at the customs. And they let us do 2 for 120 days when we told them our situation. And we had with us a 7mm rifle, which, well placed, could take care of a polar bear, but isn't exactly as powerful a gun that you would need if, worst case scenario, you would have to actually shoot a bear. But yeah, it's pretty easy to bring guns into Canada.
Luckily, you didn't have to use it.
Yeah, thankfully not.
So is there one thing or a couple of things that you can look back on as the lessons learned from the expedition? Yeah, there's it's always tough to answer that question because a lot of people are looking for lessons or something you kind of take away
from the trip after it's over. And I never have a clear answer to that. I think one thing I was just surprised at how the four of us managed to get along together and actually accomplish and finish successfully this trip, because it's a really daunting trip to do, because there's so many physical challenges, and there's reasons that people told me that it would be, next to impossible, and it certainly felt next to impossible at some points in the trip. But I think faced with that kind of challenge, forcing ourselves into a situation that is beyond really our expectations, beyond what we've ever experienced, it really it just really showed what the four of us were capable of doing and achieving. And I would add too that it was kind of unlikely that it would be the four of us doing these trips, because we're not super athletes by any means. Maybe even somewhat lazy, some people would offer to say. But there is something to be learned about putting yourselves in difficult, challenging, uncomfortable positions and situations, and really just being surprised at what you're capable of. And I think that's kind of sticks out in my mind as what impressed me about the trip and kind of what I'm taking away from it. One of the many things.
What was your biggest fear going into it?
I think the biggest fear for me was almost failure. And that loomed in my mind because, one, the nature of the trip, and it was kind of my idea I put the trip together, and I kind of thought it was possible, and Winchell certainly pushed me and the other guys to attempt to see if it was possible. So I felt a bit of personal responsibility there as well. Like if it failed, then I would really feel like I had some wild, crazy ideas and ambitions, but couldn't follow through with them. And then the other factor was we had a website up, people could track us. A lot of people knew about it. We had raised funds for the trip. So there's people back home watching us. So there's more pressure there. But I don't even think that pressure from outside sources was as much as big a factor as kind of the internal pressure that I think all of us felt to complete the trip, the pressure that we all felt, just to accomplish what we set out to do. I think that was such an enormous pressure that it manifested itself as my biggest fear, not being able to complete the route.
Sure, I understand. How long did it take to plan this trip, and how did you go about getting the funds?
Yeah, so I think it took us, it was probably about 15 months of actual planning, a lot of talking before that, probably about a year of just kind of battering around ideas. So probably about 15 months of finding people to do resupplies, finding other crew members. But we had all, I had done a bunch of put together trips before this, and everyone was experienced with organizing a trip. So that part wasn't too difficult. And I think the harder part was raising money, asking people to give money to your 4-month vacation is an interesting exercise, to say the least. So I set up a Kickstarter campaign and was able to raise a little over $4,000 there. And then it was soliciting companies for sponsorship, especially the big ticket items. So we got sponsored through Granite Gear, and they provided us with packs and the packing system.
So how does that process work, getting sponsorships?
Oh, yeah, that's it's something I'm pretty happy. I feel like I did a good job with it, but I don't think I'm too good at it. It's a lot of phone calls. It's trying to be obnoxious, but not too obnoxious. The way I compare it, it's like trying to get a girl to go out with you who's not really returning your phone calls all the time. And so it starts with a letter. I find out the PR person with the company send them an email, tell them about what we can offer, and direct them to the website, the nature of the expedition, and how much exposure their product will get through sponsorship. And then it's a lot of phone calls trying to follow up, because as one of my friends put it, people aren't too eager to call you back giving you free gear. So that's kind of the process that I found. Just trying to convince the companies that it's worth their while, and you're not just a normal Yahoo, an everyday Yahoo asking for free equipment. Is kind of the name of the game in that respect.
Sure. So any advice for someone looking to plan and carry out an expedition?
Yeah, I think, part of the fun is just planning and finding what that expedition is going to be. I mean, for me, that's really it. And I think it never gets emphasized enough in the outdoor world. And for me, it's primary, but the whole idea of imagination and be imaginative with what both you can do and what's possible. So for me, that always involved imagining routes where other people hadn't done routes, kind of connecting waterways. And there's various other ways you can go about doing that as well. So my big advice is just think big and really think of it as an exercise in imagination. And then after that, it's after the imagining, after the dreaming comes the practical side of it. And that's where things kind of get tempered down. So I would say, imagination, and then being realistic with what you can do, and having really practical plans and lining things up and being orderly about it. There are kind of two kind of polar sides to planning an expedition of this nature.
Let's talk about the movie.
Sure.
What idea came first? Did the idea for the movie come first?
The idea for the expedition came first. And I had, ever since 2005, when I went on that 122-day trip with my brother, I've been interested in filming canoe routes. He brought a camera on that trip and filmed it and made a short documentary of it. And that really kind of motivated me. I saw the potential and how cool it is really to have a movie at the end of a trip to show people. And so I filmed a couple other canoe trips on the Back River in Nunavut and on the Moisey River in Quebec, and made short 20-minute documentaries out of those. And those were, at the time, those were my first attempts at filmmaking, and those were more or less alternatives to photo albums. And I really enjoyed doing that, and I got good responses from that. So once I had this route in mind, I also thought, I want to document this and I want to make a movie. And, it was also a selling point to sponsors that their product's going to be shown in a movie, and there's going to be photographs of their gear in action. So that was also in the back of my mind. But above all, the idea came secondary to the expedition, yeah. And I wanted to make the movie more, how should I say, more of a narrative structure, have more from going from point A to point B, explaining the route along the way, so people who weren't familiar with the route, didn't know the members, could enjoy it like you would any documentary you see on TV or in a movie theater.
So what were the biggest challenges you had filming, and did you have any special equipment?
Yeah, the tough part on a trip like this is you're going for 16 hours a day, and sometimes it's in completely inhospitable conditions where your entire mind and body is focused on doing the task at hand, and the task at hand happens to be enormously demanding. You're three guys kind of maneuvering around a drop in the river, trying to pull the canoe through these rapids, or just portaging a pack through it in a particularly buggy area. So with all those things going on, you have to continually remember, get the camera out. You got to keep filming, and that's the number one challenge on a trip like this, and trying to document a trip like this, is just this dedication to having the camera out at all times. And that is something that can easily be overlooked. And there's also the issue that you've been in this area for a week or 2 weeks, say, going on 40 days, and things are familiar to you. So you don't think to get the camera out. So you can miss a lot of shots that way. So I think the biggest aspect of making the movie that I had was just continually reminding myself to have the camera out. And eventually that turns into a habit, and almost an obsessive habit of wanting to get the camera out and capturing that shot. So just having that mindset, I think, is the most important aspect. And as far as equipment goes, I had a DSLR camera, a Canon T3i that had full HD capabilities. And in order to have that by my side all the time, I had it in a Pelican case, one of these kind of indestructible, fully waterproof cases. And that was always at my feet in the canoe, or clipped into the canoe if we were going through white water. And in that way, if it was raining or if we got a bunch of water in the boat, and I never had to worry about the equipment being ruined in that casing.
I should have asked this question earlier. Tell me about the canoes.
Okay. So we had two canoes, a Nova Craft Prospector and a Dagger Venture. They haven't made the Dagger Venture for about 13 years, but we found someone who had it used and got it for, I think, about $500. And they're both kind of these wilderness tripping style canoes. They're capable of, each are capable, I think, of maybe 1,000 to 1,200 pound cargo capacity. And they have just enough rocker on them, which means they can maneuver through whitewater well. And they also track well on flat water. So they kind of have the best of both worlds in them. They're good on flat water, they're good in white water, and they have an enormous cargo capacity, which is key for a trip like this. And then they're made out of Royal X, which is I think it's a polyurethane, kind of like plastic, which is really indestructible. It can take a lot of beating, and you can throw a lot at it, and it will just bounce right back. So really high quality canoes that can stand up to a lot of wear.
Well, Pete, what is next for you?
So right now I am putting together, I'm producing and directing a documentary which is going to be about traditional canoe camping. And by traditional canoe camping, my parameters are no synthetic materials. So a big part of this movie is going to be just getting all the equipment together, putting together an outfit. And that involves a lot of meetings with craftsmen and women throughout mostly Minnesota who continue to make packs out of canvas, tents out of canvas, wooden canoes, and carve their own paddles, boot cobblers as well, and interviewing them, talking to them about why they continue with these traditional crafts, putting together an outfit, and then end of September, Will be going up into the Boundary Waters and doing a short week to 10-day canoe trip with this new outfit, which will be new for me. And this will be kind of a test run, getting familiar with everything, seeing what I need to improve, what I can tighten up. And then next summer, I will be joined with a friend of mine to go on a longer canoe trip, which will be about 40 to 45 days up in, I'm still deciding on the route, but right now I'm pretty sure it's going to be in Labrador and northern Quebec, tracing this historic route known as the Hubbard Expedition that begins on the Atlantic Ocean, goes into the interior of Labrador, and then down near the Arctic Ocean. And so that's a big term documentary movie project that I am just about to start shooting this summer. So that's what's on my plate right now.
Wow, very cool. Pete, how can people get in touch with you, and how can they obtain a copy of 2600 Above 60?
Yeah, so people can contact me through the website canoe2012.com, or you can email me at pete@canoe2012.com. And if you want to order a copy of 2600 Above 60, you can order that right off the website through PayPal. It's a DVD, just try to keep costs low, so $10 a pop, and ship that out to you right away.
Okay, Pete, thank you so much for talking to us today. Is there anything else you want to say?
No, I think did a good job of covering the trip and the challenges, and it's been a pleasure talking, Paul.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Recorded on May 7, 2013.